Your faces. Hi,
Letting
Patricia,
everybody-
Leslie, Catherine.
Hi, Mary.
Shelley.
Letting everybody in. Who has a baby?
Yeah, I was hearing a baby.
Yeah, how exciting.
I have my little girl Matilda with me. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
Start them off young. Great. Okay. I'm just going to wait because people are still streaming in so quickly, but it won't be long now. Okay, well, let's start. Welcome, everyone. This is going to be a really great event. As you probably know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a strategic pillar of IWF Canada. We take it very seriously. We have begun for the last several years to intentionally recruit a more diverse membership, and we're very passionate about it, and it's already paying off hugely. We're seeing so much new dynamism in the things we're doing with some of the new members that we are coming in and helping us have a bigger, richer, more generous view of the world, which is where we want to be. So we're going to start, before I hand off to Mary Larson, our distinguished member from Montreal who has arranged today's event. I would like to read, we have developed a new national land acknowledgement in both official languages, so I'm going to give you that now, and then we'll hand off to Mary. So here it goes. This land acknowledgement is followed by a moment of reflection on our history and humanity. As a collective and as individuals, we wish to honor the Indigenous peoples of this land where we live and gather. We wish to pay respect to the elders and knowledge holders who have been custodians of this land. It is time to ask ourselves what our action is. What steps are we taking to bring change and unity? We envision a future where we circle together, holding hands, and that entry just made this disappear. Holding hands in solidarity. Cette reconnaissance de la Terre est suivie d'un moment de réflexion sur notre histoire et notre humanité. En tant que collectivité et en tant qu'individus, nous souhaitons honorer les peuples autochtones de cette terre où nous vivons et nous nous réunissons. Nous souhaitons respecter les anciens et les détenteurs du savoir qui ont été les gardiens de cette terre. Il est temps de nous demander quelle est notre action. Quelles mesures prenons-nous pour apporter le changement et l'unité? Nous envisageons un avenir où nous formerons un cercle ensemble en nous tenant par la main en toute solidarité. So again, welcome everyone. And the wonderful Mary Larson has arranged this, and she's herself an expert. She leads the practice at MNP that covers diversity, equity, and inclusion. But she is bringing to the table the MNP expert who's been doing this for 30 years and has so much to share with us. And we're very eager to learn all about it. Mary.
Thank you. Thanks, Pauline. And frankly, I think Sandra and I are very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you today about inclusion and what it takes to create inclusive environments with you today. So I'd just like to address a fundamental question. Why would two white women talk about inclusion? So first of all, I think I want to mention the fact that, the Canadian government has recognized women as one of four equity deserving groups. So women, persons with disabilities, racialized visible minorities, and Indigenous people. I'm sure that every one of us has had many experiences of feeling excluded over the course of our lives and our careers. And I think what's very important is that we're at a time in this country and elsewhere where we can actually have a broader conversation about exclusion, not just with respect to ourselves, but with respect to others. And so we, as women, privileged women, can talk about why exclusion has to end. And it has to end for all of the 16 categories that we use to define diversity. I also just want to quote a wonderful thing that Banksy, the brilliant artist, said. And I think it kind of makes the point about why it's okay for us to have this conversation. He said, at first, he said, I thought I should shut up and listen to Black people talk about Black Lives Matter. But why would I do that? It's not their problem, it's mine. People of color are failed by the system, the white system. It's like a broken pipe flooding the apartment of the people living downstairs. It's making their lives a misery, but it's not their job to fix it. This is a white problem, and if white people don't fix it, someone will have to come upstairs and kick the door in. And I think that's what we're gently trying to do today, just open the door. Let me introduce Sandra. Sandra is a colleague, she's probably one of my two favorite colleagues, but so.
I hope this is being recorded.
Yeah, right. So Kevin will hear. Sandra is the director of MMP's EDI practice, which also encompasses issues of accessibility and decolonization. She has devoted more than 30 years of her career to addressing issues of inequity, dedicated to making workplaces places where people can work together to achieve their full potential. She was initially trained as an educator. She became a journalist and then took on the role as the first director of inclusion and engagement at CBC, and then took on a similar role at Metrolinx for its over 10,000 employees. She isn't a native of New Brunswick, just New Brunswickers were her native people, her ancestors, but she's worked in every province and territory of Canada, and she's a force of nature. I think I personally today am prepared to laugh, learn, and maybe cry a bit. Sandra.
Thank you. And thank you, Mary and Pauline and IWF for inviting me. Is my camera on? Can everybody see me?
Everybody
we can
you.
Probably put the slides up now.
Yeah, we'll jump into the slides. And what we're trying to do is not, fill your heads full of statistics and facts, but we do want to share some space at the end for questions, because I love nothing better than questions. And I think we'll just dive right in. And inclusive practices, it's something that our organizations asked to present on. Believe it or not, at a lot of conferences recently and with a lot of organizations, because I think Canadians have good intentions. But frankly, if you're a member of an equity deserving group, you're kind of tired of good intentions, and people want us to move more quickly to actions. So we're going to dive right in with the first slide. And again, thank you, IWF, for having me. I'm thrilled to be speaking to women who, of course, know better perhaps than most groups that the struggle for equity and inclusion never ends. We can see this frequently in other countries. So we really, like one of the quotes that I've been using recently, because people get tangled up in EDI. It can be complicated, and they will say things like, I just don't understand these terms. Is it EDI? Is it DEI? Well, let's just start with some common language. Diversity is a fact. The mayor of the city of Toronto likes to talk about how diverse Toronto is. He specifically didn't do anything to cause that to come about. It's a city that's fantastically and amazingly and wonderfully diverse, but it's a fact. Equity is a choice. Inclusion's an action. And then if you have inclusive spaces, inclusive schools and workplaces and hospitals, the outcome, of course, is belonging. And who doesn't want to feel as if they belong? So the reason we talk about inclusion, inclusive practices, and I'm not here to talk about lived experience beyond my own. We don't teach workshops on anti-Black racism because that's not our lived experience. But we do, Mary and I have hosted a lot of conversations, because we really do believe that at this point in our history, these conversations are important. People duck them, and particularly people in the dominant group duck them. But I think once the conversations begin, people walk away saying, okay, well, listen, I knew something I didn't know before. So awareness, however, demands strategies and actions. I remember a young person at CBC, a young reporter who was Indigenous, said to me, why don't you think we do much about this in terms of diversity and equity? And, some organizations won't collect demographic data on their company. And I said, well, because facts and awareness demand that you either come up with a strategy or that you take action. And I think sometimes people just want to not know. And in not knowing, you could just get up every day, live in your bubble and think everybody's in the same movie, when in fact we know we're not. And moving beyond the business case. So in Canada, quick history of what most people, I think depending on your age, call DEI. There's been a shift to EDI recently, but people started saying, let's make the business case. Let's convince each other that equity and inclusion would help our business. And that didn't seem really to shift much. And I remember talking to my friend and mentor, really great colleague in the past, Trevor Wilson, about this. And he said, so people started to shift to the moral cause. Canadians are good people. Why wouldn't we want to be inclusive and equitable? And then basically, I think it started to shift thanks to a pretty significant racial reckoning, not only in this country, but obviously in the US with the murder of George Floyd. In Canada, other things motivated Canadians, including, I think, conversations about residential schools and the graves and discoveries of some things that, frankly, a lot of people already knew about. So really, the question people keep asking me is, how do we start? And that's the work that Mary and I do, is we work with a wide variety of organizations who just want to get this started. I will tell you this, that once it starts in an organization, it's very organic. And we are very fortunate in that we get to walk away knowing that we've amplified the voices of others and that they will take on the work. And then you see it growing really rapidly. So we'll jump to the next slide. Okay, and again, you know, I'm trying to encourage people, don't get tangled up, don't get the rope around your feet trying to figure out what to call it. As you can see on the left, you know, we've responded to all kinds of organizations asking for help, and they call it equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, which is interesting. We've seen EDIR, reconciliation. DEI was what was most common for a few years. We see IDEA, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And recently, we've been contacted by groups who are calling their work inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism. I'm going to throw out a term that makes a lot of sense to some people. We're trying to get to human equity. And human equity is, if you're a Christian, you've heard the phrase promised land. Getting to human equity is really where we need to be, which is that everybody in every organization has an opportunity to do their best work, to aspire to the most senior position in that organization that they would like to. So, you know, really, you know, the definition of what equity looks like and what actions are appropriate is important. And then what we try to help organizations do is build on, you know, what they're doing that is right and finding the path to human equity. Everyone has a different philosophy, I think, around equity work. And for me, it's, as a former school teacher, I'm very big on the no shame, no blame. We don't get anywhere when we call people out. It is more, I think it's more where we have more success when we do a call in, when we say, can you be part of this work? And we do like to talk about what organizations have done so far that is great, because we like to jokingly say we bring the gift of hope. What else can you do beyond what you've done? And so we're going to go to the next slide. And I always like the quote, although Winston Churchill is a somewhat controversial figure, that, you know, in Canada, understanding our shared history is incredibly important. You know, when I was working as a director for Metrolinx and CBC, I would look for trainers, and oftentimes, you know, we found it challenging when we hired trainers from other countries, only because the Canadian shared history is very distinct. As is every country's. But I always like the Churchill quote that those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And yes, if you look, those are some new immigrants to Canada, and maybe some of the people on this call have ancestors who look like the folks in that picture. Okay, we'll keep moving. So shared history is important because there's some interesting things about this country that many of us, you know, are fairly, you know, a couple generations new to or very new to. But Canada is a country of people who really do believe that they are good people, that morally the Canadians do the right thing. And there's sort of early evidence that Canadians were trying to get it right. So in 1971, Canada was one of the first countries to create a multiculturalism policy. And of course, that was the first Trudeau Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. This was an official government policy intended to preserve cultural freedom of individuals and recognize, believe it or not, what they called diverse ethnic groups. And it was based on 2 founding cultures and 2 founding languages. And interestingly enough, there was a fair amount of disagreement about this policy, including from people in Quebec who felt that it, wasn't, there were some people who felt it wasn't as important to acknowledge more than the 2 founding cultures of French and English. So we have 2 official languages because of all of this work. And again, we know the languages that weren't included. If you know the story of the latest Canadian Governor General, she was highly criticized for not being able to speak French. Interestingly enough, nobody was celebrating the fact that she could speak Inuktitut and that she was the first Indigenous Inuit Governor General of Canada. So you can see that there are interesting pieces of this work, but when it was finished, a lot of Canadian, especially government officials, did say, our work is done. We are officially a multicultural nation. And so that's positive. And then we're going to look at the next slide, because the complexity of Canada is, it's on one hand, well, that was great. And then of course, on the other hand, we have our troubled past. A lot of people don't know that residential schools started pre-Confederation. There was a school in Brantford, Ontario. It was actually considered Brantford Upper Canada in 1830. The interesting thing about residential schools, and in our company, we have a complete Indigenous unit of over 100 people that work on projects with Indigenous peoples and communities. I don't claim to be an expert on that history any more than I think a lot of Canadians, but we do have people across the country now who are doing brilliant work with Indigenous communities and have the lived experience. Surprisingly, the goals of residential schools were never hidden. It was always assimilation and genocide. We saw that the children who went to those schools, it was made very clear from the time those children arrived in schools that you were losing your language, your culture, the games you might have played, your traditions, you were losing your family, you were losing all ties. And the early documents from the Canadian federal government basically say, we've got to get these people out of that Indigenous, native world and get them into a civilized school system. Of course, these were in no way schools. So again, our troubled past, you look at some of these situations in our own country and it's a bit perplexing, but it took Stephen Harper till 2008 to stand up in the House of Commons and acknowledge this entire troubled past. Some of you know that Pope Francis came to Alberta in July of 2022, and that was the first time that the Catholic Church, I think, waited to offer up what some people say was not a formal apology, but to address the Catholic Church's role. And again, it's a pretty troubling thing when you recognize that the residential school system was supported by, Christian churches, all kinds of Christian churches, not just the Catholic Church, and that it was considered to be a great success. I'll tell you that the intergenerational trauma that this entire past has caused has been hugely negative in terms of the next generation. If you have family members, as I do, who had family members who went through this system, generations later, people are still suffering from what that really did to their families and their connections and to the loss of culture. And I think a lot of employers are finally realizing that this is a key issue in workplaces in Canada in 2023. So we're going to talk a little bit about Equity 101. And I apologize if I'm speaking too quickly. I really want to make sure we have time for your questions. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what does equity mean in this context. A lot of Canadians think when you talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, that you're talking about Black versus white. You're talking about skin, which is really an interesting thing because, as Mary pointed out, there's at least 16 kinds of diversity that we actually talk about, including a lot of emphasis recently on invisible disability, neurodiversity. But it's not about male versus female. This is about a society's dominant group. And every society everywhere in the world every country has a group that is considered the dominant group, and it varies depending on where you are. I've taught in Taipei, in Barcelona, in Zurich, in a lot of different countries, and each country's participants in that workshop can tell you, well, this is the group in our country that holds power. The terrifying thing, frankly, about positions of power and equity is that all the studies show that people who are in positions of power unconsciously feel entitled to take more. And so I will say that as one of my earliest discoveries working as a journalist in a Crown Corporation, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was that gender equity was a huge issue. Very few women were in senior roles when I started. Frequently, the shifts were over 12 hours. People couldn't go home. If you had children, you were really precluded from working there, and a lot of women left. And I remember a period where about every week, someone sent a massive email to a large group saying, I'm going to have to quit working here as a reporter, and I've resigned. I need to go home and see my family. So I was in a group of women who started fighting back against that. And we had some great success at CBC in terms of gender equity. Although today's report on Canadian newsrooms says that 51% of newsrooms employees are women. So we've held that number and it hasn't gone down. And so I felt really happy about that until somebody said to me, okay, well, your group did well, women, a lot of women and women from, diverse backgrounds have been promoted. And then, the question is, well, who else isn't at the table? And, the challenge that was offered to me, frankly, by a very young Black reporter said to me, I said, oh, it's just terrible. It's just terrible because we're not seeing people being promoted into senior roles. White women have done fairly well. And she said to me, well, I keep saying to people, we don't need your white tears. I need someone to figure out why this corporation isn't promoting equity deserving people to be in leadership. So again, to Mary's point earlier, I don't see a lot of people stepping up to battle the system that was designed to work as it is now, which is not in favor of people who aren't frankly white and male. And so I took up that challenge and went to Chicago and sat in on a program at Loyola University. And CBC launched a first program called DEL, Developing Emerging Leaders, in 2016. And they've graduated employees from equity deserving groups for 7 years now. I'm hugely proud of that accomplishment before I left. But I will say that that was a classic example of someone coming to someone who had a bit of power and saying, I just don't need your good intentions or your sympathy. I need you to help us change this. So that's the call to action that I offer you today. Please consider using your voice to take on the system, if you like. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So again, when people ask about inclusive workplaces and organizations, it's really very simple. You can train yourself to walk into every room and every situation and say, who's not here? Who's not at the table? When I started doing DEI work a long time ago, I had several colleagues who were, in senior positions in organizations. And one gentleman said to me something I'd heard many, many times, not hearing as much in the last 2 years, but it was, we don't need to have those people at the table because our group has diversity of thought. And I thought that was very amusing. And I said to this gentleman, diversity of thought? And he said, yeah, I can speak on behalf of other people. And I said, wow, that's so you can speak on behalf of an Indigenous employee in the company who's 25 years old. You would understand that perspective. And he said, well, yeah, we think we do. And so if you see the words diversity of thought, I ask you to take out a Sharpie and eliminate them from the document you're reading. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is figuring out who's not at the table. Is it your youngest employees? Is it your employees who are dealing with disabilities? Is it people who are racialized? Is it people of color? Is it people from religious backgrounds that don't feel comfortable working in your organization for a wide variety of reasons? So again, walk into a room and keep asking who's not here and ensure that their voices are heard. MNP's success in EDI comes from one thing. The organization agreed with the concept of broadly consulting. We do not speak for other people. We hold focus groups, we have listening sessions, and we ask people to share their experiences of working somewhere or living somewhere. And of course, anonymous surveys are great for that if you wonder if where you work is inclusive or if your organization is. So a lot of organizations, and I'm talking specifically now about where are we on the timeline. In 2023, a lot of companies are very comfortable talking about diversity. And they say, well, these are our numbers. And you'll notice that the newest employees at the very entry-level roles in organizations tend to be more diverse. And as we move up to the top of the organization, there's that whitening you see where you see that many of the senior leaders don't represent your city in all its richness and diversity. And that's why we keep saying to people, now, yes, representation matters, but it's okay to tackle diversity. That's incredibly important because after all, a lot of the work we do is about making sure that the inside of an organization looks like the outside. So if your inside doesn't match the outside and you're in the city of Toronto or Montreal and you have an organization that doesn't look like your community, you're falling down in diversity. But more importantly, a lot of organizations will hire people from fantastically different backgrounds, and then they fall down on inclusion. We worked with an organization that hired 30 Indigenous employees, fantastic. The community had a huge population of Indigenous peoples. In that case, it was First Nations. 6 months later, we go back, half the staff have left. That means they didn't feel they belonged and the organization wasn't inclusive. So inclusive organizations have cultures grounded in purpose, belonging, and impact. And we can actually teach people how to run an inclusive meeting. We can teach people how to look around the room and notice the people who aren't speaking. And so again, there's ways and tools we can use to make sure that the dominant group isn't running the show. Some of you might remember the years where everyone in the organization would get a Merry Christmas greeting. And I think companies are actually much hipper now to the fact that please don't assume everyone celebrates the same thing, because they absolutely don't. And you see the diversity stats for Canada, you know that to be true. So we're going to do a little experiment here, if that helps. Okay, just going to go back to a second. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide. So I'm going to ask, I think Pauline's going to help us here, because what we're going to do for a minute is do a little bit of time travel. A lot of people we've worked with over the years have said to me, I keep hearing the word inclusive and inclusion. I don't know what it means. What does that mean? Like, we're nice people. We have staff meetings, we have social events. So they really ask us, I'm not kidding, what does the word inclusive mean? And we say, it really is to broadly consult, ensure all voices are heard and different perspectives are welcome. And still people weren't getting it. And finally, about 2 years ago, I said, okay, forget about inclusion. Let's talk about exclusion. So we're going to go to the next slide. And it's a strange thing about humans because, again, not using the word inclusion helps people to understand what it is we're actually speaking about. And to be excluded is an incredibly painful experience. I don't care who you are or what your background is, it's painful. So now we flip the script and use the word inclusion. So everybody likes to be invited. And if you even look at the photo of a child who's not being included and is outside the circle, we all, I think, can remember a time in our lives when we were not invited. I started my career in very much male-dominated newsrooms, where frankly, dozens of times a week, I received a message given to me in many different ways, which I'll summarize as, it would be so much easier if you weren't here. Because, as a woman in a newsroom, I was bringing my own perspective and trying to argue for stories that I felt we should cover, and often was told, well, nobody cares about a daycare strike. Well, I care about a daycare strike. And my male colleague said, well, I don't, because my wife is home with our children. And I said, okay, congratulations, and just moved on. So we're just going to ask some people if you could post or actually share to tell us very briefly, if you can, about a time in your life when you truly felt excluded. And we'll see if anyone is brave and will share with us.
Is this the last slide, Sandra?
No, it is closest to the last slide, but no, it's
All right,
not.
so we can leave the slide up and just use
Yeah.
the chat.
Anybody willing to share? And you can write it in the chat.
Well, maybe I'll start, Sandra, if no one's
Yeah, thank you.
stepping up. When I was 13, we moved to London, Ontario, and my dad was the vice principal charged with discipline, the first lay vice principal in this Catholic high school that had always been run by priests. And I had to go there. And I was like literally excluded, like people wouldn't speak to me in the hallways. And then a terrible thing happened, you got worse, you know? So just being the child of someone who's in a position to discipline other kids, it made me persona non grata in any kind of group, you know? And it was a horrible experience, just horrible, you know? But I'm sure that kind of thing has happened to all of us. Here's one, Heather. I was 7 months pregnant back when there was still smoking in all the bars and restaurants. I was a key player in a huge M&A deal. We signed the deal and the lead banker says, "This is awesome. Tonight to celebrate, we're going to a bar downtown to watch a boxing match on closed circuit TV." Just what a 7 month pregnant person wants to do. Yay.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's an interesting example. I was working with a VP 2 years ago who came to me, and I won't reveal the organization or the name, but he shut the door and he said, "You do this kind of inclusion work, right?" And I said, "Yes, I do this kind of inclusion work." And he said the most fascinating thing. He said, "I'm holding staff events and no one's showing up." Well, he said, "That's not true. I guess a few people are showing up. It's the same 6 guys every time." And I said, "Okay, well, that is fascinating. So what are you offering people?" And he said, "Oh, well, I say every Thursday, let's head to the bar and we'll do a chat, leave work early and we'll do a chat session." And I pick a Tuesday night. And I we go at, 6 o'clock, give people a chance to, finish up their work. And I said, so some finish at 5 and hang around and then wait. And the offer is to go to a bar and drink with you and then go home. And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you know how many members of your staff have to get home, or they've got a daycare deadline that's terrifying to miss?" And he said, "No, and I said, "Well, can you please ask your staff what they would like to do for the next social event?" Anyway, it was stunning because he basically at an SMT meeting said, "That really worked. We're doing something now that is like a tobogganing party because so many people have kids." And I said, "It's amazing what happens when we ask people." So again, the key message in inclusion, ask if you don't know. Okay, Pauline, I think you've got more.
All right, so next one is Holly Matheson, who says, working in an arts context, the male members of the music staff being invited for a shared lunch with the boss and not me, the only female.
Oh, wow.
And Miner says, early in my career, I was given responsibility for a team of 5 men. They would go into the bathroom and smoke cigarettes, not doing the work. I was left outside the door to figure out how to inspire them to perform. Good one. D. Patterson. How about being invited to a strip club to celebrate a deal? I was the only woman on the deal. I was not excluded, but not really interested in joining the men. Yeah, no kidding. So Leslie Quinton, I was the first woman executive in a real estate development company in the late 90s. The other executives weren't sure if I would, quote unquote, feel comfortable attending a reception with the other executives. Sheila Stoneham. I was in Barcelona at the World Mobile Congress. The head of a major device manufacturer left after dinner with my boss and the other men to go to a strip club. The real meeting happened at the strip club. Shan McGrail. Early in my career, my male colleagues led by my boss strongly suggested to me to go back to my hotel so that he could go to a gentleman's club. Define quote around the world, a gentleman. Heather Talk again. D, I was the only woman on the deal too, except the steno. I got asked a lot about when the coffee refills were due to arrive. Brenda Kenny. Working in engineering, I was frequently the only woman. Setting aside cat calls on pipeline rights of way and girly posters in the work sheds, try feeling included at the 8-man camp with only men's washrooms. Sleep well.
Well, and isn't it interesting how people communicate to us that we're not really needed, or it would be nicer if we weren't there. You know, I was sharing the story recently around the recent Order of Canada Awards. One of my good friends and a woman who actually persuaded me to join the CBC just won Order of Canada, Colleen Jones, and we were puzzling over why it took so long. Anyway, a recent audit showed Canadian women are in the minority, very, very low percentage, although we're 51% of the population. And people don't think Canadian women have had or led lives of such excellence, apparently, that they can be nominated. Oh, and I see my colleague Mary, exec at a large multinational, and working is it Arvida?
It's Arvida.
Arvida. We went to dinner and they dropped, oh my God, what's with the gentlemen's club? And they left me and my one colleague from Montreal. Well, it's fascinating. I worked in a newsroom where the men in the newsroom referred to themselves as the lads. And they did everything on their own. And there were 3 women, and I was one of the 3, including an on-air host. And we sat and marveled at this idea that they were running the show. And of course, you don't need me to mention Lisa LaFlamme. I'm sure every time you hear a newsroom, you think of that. And I will just say that the experience of someone coming in basically and being from the dominant group and deciding about the fate of a female employee is exceptionally common.
And here's Sylvie
yeah.
Mercier. As a young executive, I was excluded from pay reevaluation because I was not, quote unquote, supporting my family like a man, even though I had 2 kids. I did fight and was recognized, but that felt terrible to have to fight.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And so you can see that if these experiences happen to you at a workplace, you certainly wouldn't feel included. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, there's another one.
Leslie Quinton, I've also been excluded in other contexts because of language and religion. The feeling of exclusion is equally painful, whatever the reason.
Well, and so instead of celebrating difference and ensuring that organizations are inclusive, you know, the key thing I try to train people to do is to look at how you operate, look at the notes that you send out. I will say that COVID was the gift. It was a gift to us, and we didn't know it was a gift because not only were many folks from equity deserving groups telling us through surveys that they really appreciated not having to come to work and deal with microaggressions, or to be asked over and over again, do you really have to wear that headscarf, or your English is really good, or can you tell me where did you really come from? They were able to avoid some of that fun, that office fun, I say sarcastically, and work from home, as were persons with disabilities who didn't have to wait an hour and a half and hope the Accessa bus showed up, or that they were able to get on transit without being trampled. So again, if you look around your organization with I like to say the eyes of a tourist, pretend you haven't worked there long, and look to see who's not in the meetings, who's not being consulted, why aren't they being consulted? And any CEO who isn't broadly consulting with staff is frankly a fool, because if you know anything about wisdom of crowds, the best intelligence you can ever gather comes from your own employees. So when we work with organizations, we say, well, we have to, anonymously survey staff. And as Mary knows, many CEOs will say to us, can you tell me who said that? No, we cannot. But we like to hold up the picture and say, this is what people are experiencing here. Final thing I'll tell you about exclusion at work. Overwhelmingly, Canadians who leave a workplace because they felt excluded, either because they were of a religion, of an ethnicity, of a background, they were a new Canadian. They don't tell HR when they leave why they're leaving. They simply leave. So please be aware that if people are being excluded, they will quietly quit, they will go out the door, and they will look for an environment where they can be fully accepted and where difference is celebrated, which of course is what any smart organization would do. Okay, we're going to keep going because I'm conscious of the time. I have to wrap this up quickly because we do want to see if there's any other questions. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Pauline, for helping, and thank you for everyone who bravely shared. So we've talked about this. Just very briefly, I don't know if you've heard about these benches, but they're a brilliant idea. Some school boards in Canada are putting a bench in every schoolyard. And if you're lonely, and if 5 children said they won't play with you, and they don't like you, and you can't join in the fun, these kids go sit on a bench, and the other children who actually have empathy training walk over and say, hi, who are you? Do you want to join my group? And having talked to kids who've had this experience, you wonder why people didn't come up with this years ago, because as we know, children began practicing and experimenting with excluding and being cruel to people at a very young age. And this is an attempt to ensure that they have empathy and that they can walk over to somebody and say, hey, what's going on? No one will play with me. Come over with us. So we'll go to the next slide. If your school doesn't have one of these benches, please ask them. So again, we're born equal, and then we start excluding people, we start marginalizing people, we start putting up barriers and hoping members of equity deserving groups don't see them. So, you know, when you hire people, please focus on ensuring inclusion and representation. You know, we have to invest in building belonging and agency. We have to see and respect colleagues as individuals. I don't even have time to get into the recruiting bias. And again, at CBC, hundreds of employees from equity deserving groups not considered for leadership. A lot of that was a bias that, oh, I just didn't think they wanted to be a leader, really? So again, get energy and commitment from leaders and colleagues, and just keep trying to remember who's not at the table and who are we trying to include. And we'll keep going. I'm going to take just a couple more minutes before questions, but exclusion, and you can get a copy of this deck. Exclusion looks like a lot of different things. It's even, you know, an introverted colleague. You know, I've trained people to read body language in a meeting and to see if somebody nods but doesn't speak. Take a moment to say, you know, Suzanne or Omar, I see you nodded. Would you like to contribute, or would you like to send us your contribution later? Not everybody wants to stand up in a meeting and speak. You know, this is exclusions believing in a stereotype about someone who doesn't look like you. Oh, I didn't know you did that on the weekend. What do you mean? I have children. Of course I did that. It's assuming people aren't interested in being parts of committees and projects without even asking them. I learned long ago, wisdom of crowds, again, I decide nothing on my own. I bring together the widest variety of voices and ask those people to help us come up with solutions. They're not for me, it's always better for the team. And again, it's simple things like assuming everyone celebrates the same holidays. And again, I've spoken to you about diversity of thought. It's my most hated phrase in the last 10 years. So if you see it, get rid of it. And next up, and again, I'm not going to go through all of these slides. We'll go to the next slide though on words matter. You know, words have an incredible power. So, you know, when you hear a word that excludes others, try to change the word, or if it's a word that somehow marginalizes someone. I remember someone said to me, I was in the US and they said illegal aliens. And I said, what a fascinating term that you still use it in 2023. So I will only use the words New Canadian. Because I'm a Canadian and my people came here from Ireland and Scotland and Germany, and I'm not a new Canadian, but let's stop with immigrant refugee. By the way, Canada is one of the only countries in the world that uses the term visible minority, and it's being challenged. And people are asking for all kinds of different options, including racialized, but people thought that people who weren't white would be a minority forever in Canada, and that's not even the truth. You'll see that the latest census results will show you how Canada is changing dramatically in I think key cities. Okay, we're going to keep going. So look for those silly words like middleman and get rid of them.
Or master bedroom.
Oh, master bedroom's a good one. Yeah, I literally heard a guy yesterday on CBS say, you know, we've got to find the right middleman. I was like, middleman. I do love the grow a pair, working mother. Someone said to me, I'm a working mother. And I said, well, can we just say mother? So learn the power of a better synonym, please. Okay. And these are the ones that you see some friends cringe when you're in a meeting. By the way, if you're Canadian, the phrase, pardon my French, when I worked with some folks at Radio Canada, they said, if we could just get Canadians to stop swearing and then saying, pardon my French, I'd be very excited. It's incredibly offensive. And so again, if you set yourself up as someone who's okay with hearing anything, you'll hear a lot. And I really mean that. You'll hear people will come up to you after a meeting and say, I saw you roll your eyes. You know, do they even know what peanut gallery means? So again, if you think you're using a phrase that's offensive, Google it. I mean, I grew up before Google and we had to figure things out, and there's no excuse now for not learning, just Google it. Imagine hearing open the kimono in a meeting or circle the wagons. I've had several colleagues who've said to me, you know, I think you're going too far, just don't go off the reservation. And I've said, don't what? Don't go off the reservation. And rule of thumb, peanut gallery, sold down the river. There's a wide variety of phrases. And again, none of them need to be used. English language and French language have millions of words, find better ones. Oh man, the office, that was a big thing I heard. And I had somebody who sent me an invite once to come to their meeting, and their meeting was about changes in transit. And the meeting was called, "Are you crazy? Why shut down a train track?" And I wrote and I said, it's National Mental Health Month in Canada. I'm wondering if you should retitle the name of your workshop, "Are you crazy?" Somewhat offensive. Yes, ableist terms. You're absolutely right. I was part of the accessibility directorate in Ontario, and we launched our first paid internships for persons with disabilities at CBC. I will just tell you, back to Mary's point about how we all need to speak. It's the work of many people. I had a group of people who said to me that they were surprised that I had launched the paid internships for persons with disabilities, and I said, why? And they said, well, because you're not disabled, and everything we do, we're biased because we have a disability. So yeah, I really like the ableist terms. Please look out for those. What about using terms like chairman versus chair? Yeah, and chief in titles? Absolutely. You know, when there's a better word, find it. And again, it's just, to me, it's good manners. Okay, we're gonna keep going. So this is what I think I'm obsessed with. Mary knows I'm obsessed with the census. And I spend a lot of time every year. Well, not every year, because it's every 5 years. This year we had to wait 6 years to get a census. So the country is changing and people aren't even aware of it. And it's kind of unfortunate because Stats Canada is careful about releasing data. They don't want to scare the dominant group, is my theory. But really in Canada, groups formerly known as minority will reach majority status by 2044. And 48% of Gen Z are racial or ethnic minorities. And that's from the Canadian Centre with Diversity Inclusion. They're doing some great work as well, consistently. But again, we call it an EDI journey because it begins with one step. Forget tokenism. You know, I always tell this story because it makes me laugh. Oh yeah, the word chairman, chief. I avoid the word chief as well, but I think there's, as I say, take a look at the words and then ask a lot of people what a better option would be. When we look at diversity again in Canada, you see a lot of organizations, especially dominant group, will ask people from equity deserving groups to be the face of the organization. So my son-in-law's a Black Nova Scotian, and he left a company once, and he said one of the reasons he wanted to leave was every year somebody from marketing would call and ask him if he wanted to be in a photo shoot. And he said, I'm the only Black employee in the division. And I said, no, but why don't you hire some more Black people and then you won't have to just keep calling me. That's tokenism when you get tapped, as everyone knows. Demographic surveys are hugely helpful. And we're going to go quickly to questions. And I will just say the last slide that we want you to look at, this one, is our Canadian cities are already diverse. These are the recent numbers. If you haven't Googled the 2021 released in 2022 census, please do. So I'm going to stop babbling because you can probably tell I could talk about this for 4 hours straight. And we've really just, this is skim milk. I haven't really got to the, take hours to get through some of this material. And
it would be wonderful, Sandra, if we could have your deck posted to the website with the recording. That would be very helpful.
Emily has it. Emily has it. So she
Emily
can
has
send it.
Okay. So Emily, can we stop the slides now?
Can we stop?
No, I just meant because I'm scrolling them. So just before I go to any questions, Sandra, I just want to comment that that we, you know, that even a couple of things that you said, which are absolutely legitimate, but for me, it lit up how this learning journey is very complex, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, I'll give you 2 examples in what you said that I reacted to as a francophone, right? You said 1971 Quebecers didn't like multiculturalism policy because they didn't think other people deserved to have the same recognition. The lens through which they were reacting was this is a deliberate attempt to
Yes.
make us a smaller and smaller minority over time.
Yep.
Legitimizing,
Yep.
putting multiculturalism up on the altar is a
Yep.
way to diminish francophones.
Yes.
That was how they saw it. Okay.
That's absolutely right. Yep.
And the other point is about gendered language. The French language is a gendered language. You cannot, there's not a single term that is not gendered in the language. Okay.
Yes.
And between feminists in Quebec and feminists in France, there's a fight about that.
Oh, yeah.
Because the French women say, if it's important, it's a male term, and I'm just going to call myself the male term.
Right.
And in Quebec, we have said, no, everything is open to women. And if a woman occupies it, it's a feminine term. You know, so all of these things are very complicated.
Well,
and
they
don't
are
necessarily translate between cultures and languages, you know?
No, they're incredibly complex. And again, you know, I think what people have to understand is it's complex work. It can be fraught, but if we don't have the conversations, we're never going to understand the perspectives of others.
Absolutely.
So, you know,
please, can we get your hands up if anybody has questions, because we really have very little time left. Thalia, go ahead. You're muted, however, my dear. Can you unmute? Or is it not you? You're just putting your hand on the screen. Okay. Anybody else have a question, comment, want to? I'd hoped to be able to see Brenda LaRose was supposed to be on this call, and as an executive recruiter, she specialized in diversity. I would have been interesting to get her view on this. But Dee Patterson, why don't you go ahead? Your hand is up, and
next, thank you. That was a very good presentation, Sandra. Thank you. Definitely food for thought. So a couple of things. One was, so I was interested in your point of view on diversity of thought. Where I've seen that used is more, not where somebody's trying to speak for somebody else, but more that you really do need a lot of different people around the table to cover everything off. That's how I would think of it. But my one question is on, you know, we're running into difficulties hiring for boards where you're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to, you know, broaden your board members. And sometimes it's hard when somebody comes on a board and they realize, oh, they're the only one. So is that tokenism? But it's not. It just takes so much time. I don't know whether you have any suggestions on that.
Well, yeah, you know, here's the thing. I think somebody has to be the first. And if you come in the door and you're the first, so I was appointed the director of diversity at CBC by a woman, Heather Conway, brilliant boss, brilliant mentor, who was one of the first women in banking who came out and said, yeah, I'm gay. And so she was the first, and she didn't see enough progress and, you know, eventually moved over to the CBC. But because she'd been the first, she was determined for the rest of her life to make sure that other people would join. And so again, somebody has to be the first person in the door. Somebody had to be the first, you know, Supreme Court justice who was female. That's not the challenge. I think the challenge is when organizations stall at the one-offs. So they, you know, you see the photo of the board and they have the dominant group is still the dominant group. You know, you look at the current premiers and leaders of, you know, territories in Canada, and we've had major slippage. They're almost, I guess they're 99% white males of approximate same height and age. And they definitely dress the same, because I show the picture in workshops and people groan. So, you know, having one woman in that group is not enough. And just so you know, there's a lot of DEI, EDI research around what happens when there's only one woman up against the 10 who are not female or from diverse backgrounds. They have a very difficult and lonely time, and they don't win many fights. So you need to get this, not majority, but you need to get a tipping point, which is to say that if you get to 40%, you get to 50%, you can see changes in decisions. But to your point, it's never wrong to appoint somebody the first. I've hired the first Indigenous executive producer for CBC Thunder Bay. Brilliant. He's brilliant. And he opened the door for other people. And we, you know, we should be all mentoring and looking out for the next generation of people to take up this fight. Again, I say I don't see a lot of people taking up the fight, but yeah, I don't know if that answers it. But again, I wouldn't be afraid or shy away from appointing someone to a role in which they are the first, sadly in the US, and somebody actually points up a really good point. Certain populations cannot thrive if there's only one first. And I definitely agree. If you can, I challenged a board I worked with 2 years ago to create 2 positions.
Yeah,
and to
not
hire 2
everyone who's a
people.
first is prepared to open doors for others, and they don't own the
Yeah,
problem.
that's
So
right.
I
Yeah.
really want to, Sandra, I really want to get in 2 people who've been waiting, Leslie Quinton and Holly Matheson, before we sign off, and we have very little time left. So Leslie, please, let's go to you.
I'm going to do this very fast. Thank you, Sandra, for your comments, and thank you to all the members who are here. This is definitely a journey for us, and there's going to be uncomfortable moments as we try our best, make some mistakes, but learn from them. The question is that how do we as an organization get beyond tokenism in a very concrete way? I mean, our sense is, and we've spent a lot of hours talking this as a board, is that we start with, we obviously need to have a broader, more inclusive and diversified membership, which we've succeeded in doing to a large part. And then that will help us to create more people within the various volunteer roles and then up to the board. But because it feels very artificial to say, well, we need somebody on the board who acts like this, or who believes in that, or looks like that. So is there some other part of the recipe that we're missing in your mind, Sandra?
Well, it's interesting because, I've done a lot of work around EDI demographics. And what we say to people is, if you're in the city of Toronto and it's just insanely diverse, and your entire SMT or your board are, 60% white males and 40% white females, you have a big problem. Your inside, again, doesn't match the outside. So what we'll do is we actually looked at the demographics for the city of Toronto, which are easily available. And we said, who are the largest groups in terms of equity deserving? And, yes, we would like to recruit somebody who self-identifies as a person with disability. We'd like to have that perspective on the board. We'd like to have, Toronto's Black community is huge. And again, anti-Black racism in Canada, especially in the city of Toronto and in Montreal, is that the stats are so horrible, I cringe to read them. But the reality is that you can use that, you can use those demographics as a guide. So what we said is, if I'm in a city and a huge number of residents are Indigenous, why wouldn't I say I need that representation on the board? And, Mary and I have done a lot of work recently with boards, and Mary's been doing that work her whole life. It's new for me, but I'm impressed by the boards that are not targeting, but they're saying, we've got enough of this perspective. We need to have more Indigenous board members, and we're going to hire a recruiting agency who specializes in that. We're going to find them and set them up for success, and it's working really well. So make sure your inside matches your outside, and don't be afraid, to actually, look at who lives or works or who your membership could be. But somebody asked a really good question. Isn't there diversity within white women too? Absolutely. And there's diversity within white men. And again, don't ever look at a photo and think the person's background and whether they're diverse and who they are. Don't make assumptions, because often we get it wrong. So Holly, I don't know if that helps.
Holly, are you still there? Because Holly's bouncing.
I am, but my baby's having a meltdown.
That's
I'm
fine.
so sorry.
We need to see more babies.
Oh no, she stopped. Okay, now that I'm talking,
Okay.
she's okay. I was
Please.
just going to very briefly touch on something Sandra was saying. I work for symphony orchestras and opera companies as a music director, and we have this really genuine, I think, desire, as with a lot of sectors, to diversify who we have on stage, who we have on the board, who we have in the audience, and be far more inclusive and representative as well, and that it then does lead to a genuine diversity of art and thought. But we have this issue with something like classical music, which you start training when you're 4 years old. It's not something you just study at university. It requires people to have been starting that process for us to hire them now in the 70s and 80s, which is to have been in a family that had enough money to afford music lessons and an instrument. And
you can't retrofit this stuff.
You can't. So our effort at the moment is actually with schools and children and trying to.
I was going to say that's your only recourse, because even,
Yeah.
you know, we've been asked about women in engineering and it's not getting any better. And a lot of it is because women who graduate as engineers go into workplaces that aren't inclusive and they decide, I'd rather not be here. Kind of the same as frankly, lawyers on Bay Street. But what's interesting about your point is always ask yourself, how can I reverse engineer this, which you're doing? How can I actually figure out a way to get past this? So you'd have to go young. You know, we told Engineers Canada, stop talking to gals, women in universities, go into elementary schools and start figuring out the STEM piece. Like, why aren't young girls believing that they can be engineers? By the way, if they had a father, a brother, or an uncle who was an engineer, they were more apt to be successful because they grew up with people who said, don't be ridiculous, you can do this, you're brilliant. But you do have to start at a much younger age and figure out how can you start developing that next generation of classical musicians, and how do we also ensure who comes to, you know, what many, as you know, orchestras in the US and arts organizations are looking at the affordability. You know, if I can't afford to take a taxi, but there's a GO train, I'd love to go to the orchestra, but has anyone ever talked to me about what a great experience it is? Was when I was in school, was I exposed to live music? And many children aren't.
Yeah,
So
I think Canada, I mean, actually I live in the UK, but work in Canada, and in both countries, the arts provision in schools is just.
Yeah, and it's been cut too, right? So that's interesting. So yeah, I think I mean, you do have to go to the younger generation and try and ensure. And the thing is, I'll give you an example. You know, we met with the Construction Association of Ontario, and they said, what are we going to do? The average construction worker is 65 years old. And I said, well, you know, why don't you reach out to the people you've ignored for the last 100 years? You know, do you ever drive by a construction site and see women? Rarely. There's women, there's Indigenous peoples, there's all kinds of, you know, racialized communities who would, you know, when they find out what a roofer makes. And so what did Home Depot do? They set up apprenticeship tents all over the US and invited people from, you know, really, I think, you know, communities where people were struggling with employment, and they offered free apprenticeships. So guess who's joining the construction industry in the US? Tons of kids from Roxbury, Massachusetts, whose parents went, this is an incredible opportunity. It's a free apprenticeship. And like my mother shoved somebody over and said, sign up here. And the roofers, who were Italians in Boston, said, Italian immigrants from in Boston said, we've never met more incredible, brilliant people. Like, so they've diversified an entire industry by reverse engineering it and saying, how could we fix this? Who's not here? And that's inclusion. Who wasn't on a construction site? Pretty easy to figure it out. And they figured it out in 10 minutes. So,
Sandra, this is absolutely wonderful, but we're way over our time. Just the last little, as we go out, I'm going to cite Ann Miner here, who makes a wonderful point to end this. Our generation is comprised of many first, only, and lonely. We need to send the ladder back down to welcome all to achieve their highest and best potential in a safe and collaborative environment. One day we will eliminate that first, only, and lonely isolation.
That's a fabulous quote. I'm going to keep that one. Thank you.
All right.
That's brilliant.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Sorry we went a little over time, but it was worth it. See you soon. Bye-bye.